would like to introduce and tell you all about Drishti. Drishti is a profession organization that has been serving individual families, mainstream schools, as well as the special education needs population since 1994 in Mumbai and 2014 in Bangalore. Our services addresses needs of not just an individual but extend to those of the families, their homes as well as the school. So we are very strong advocates of positive mental health and the philosophy of inclusive education. It's been a journey of 3 decades now. So we began with our only center-based services, making an impact that has been our core vision and the genesis of all that we do. So our key focus is to move with the time and adopt and adapt to, and try and address the key question that troubles educationists these days. And that's how we have started for the Prabhav courses. So Prabhav was founded in the year 2019 as an online platform, not just to empower parents, educators, therapists, but it also there to help others effectively in order to maximize each child's potential. So Prabhav online resources are designed for in-service adult learners, structured for a wide range of learning styles. So there are three variants in each courses for the learners to choose from: Insight, Light, and Advanced. So Insight is a 1 hour course that provides unique opportunity into the subject matter. It's a subject for those who wish to know just enough or just take a peek at the real thing. Light is which would be for 2 to 3 hour course that provides in-depth knowledge and skill on the subject, a fully loaded and a comprehensive format, and advanced, which is 4 to 5 hours of course that provides everything that the light has to offer, but it also consists of case studies to equip learners with the skills for application-based learning. Plus, you have quizzes, you have evaluation designs to give objective feedback to the learners. Also, the versions are pre-recorded videos or they are voiceover presentation and gives you a resource in form of reading material and appropriate video links. So, coming up with the quick information, we have these three upcoming workshops. We have these three modules coming up, which is a 3 hour toolkit courses. First is anti-bullying and prevention for training toolkit for parents and teachers, and next is social emotional learning for children, a toolkit for parents. So that's all about the courses and the Drishti as we function. So let me introduce to our two amazing guest speakers for today. We have Miss Sachi Mulki with us. She's a training master for at Sisters Living's work. She's a psychologist by training. Miss Sachi has completed her M.Sc in Clinical Psychology from Manipal Academy of Higher Education. At Sisters Living Work, she facilitates suicide prevention workshop that aims to raise awareness and equip participants to serve as a first responder to someone in the suicide crisis. She also facilitates the support group conducted by Sister Living Works for mental health and survivor of suicide loss. So welcome Ms. Sachi for today's webinar. And with us, we also have Miss Nyana Sabharwal. Miss Nyana Sabharwal is a career suicidologist and a trained mental health and suicide preventionist. Her focus areas comprises of suicide prevention, intervention, and post-intervention. She's the founder of Safe Space NGO and also the co-founder of We Hear You. She has a master's in psychology and the Neuroscience of Mental Health from King's College London. She is an invited expert in the Indian Association of Private Psychiatric Task Force for Suicide Prevention and a lived experience facilitator at the American Association of Suicidology. So, a warm welcome, Ms. Naina Sabharwal and Ms. Sachi, for today's webinar. So, oh God, the profile is such huge, and I think this is suicide is one of the most important and one of the impactful topic that we always would reach out to an expert. So I would not take much time, and I would hand over to Miss Sachi, and then we can take it with Miss Naina. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karishma. I hope my voice is audible.
Yes, it's audible, it's clear.
Let me just share my screen.
Yeah, the screen is visible. We can see.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Sachi, and thank you so much for joining. So, I work with an organization called Sisters Living Works. Sisters Living Works is a not for profit organization which is dedicated to the cause of suicide prevention. Um, so, the organization started in the year 2015. It was founded by Mrs. Gayatri Datta after she lost her family members to suicide. And having experienced the pain and grief it caused her, she wanted to work for the to create awareness and prevent suicide, because we know that there is a lack of awareness. There's a lot of information when it comes to suicide, and which is essentially what our organization has been working towards. Um, so our mission is prevention of suicide in India by raising community awareness, community involvement, education, and advocacy for change. So we work primarily in two areas. One is in terms of conducting workshops and training courses, which focus on equipping people with the basic knowledge and skills to help someone who might be in a suicidal crisis. We've also very recently initiated a training course that focuses on school counselors and educators, because the idea is to initiate a suicide free environment in schools. Um, and we've also been facilitating groups for survivors of suicide loss, as well as a general mental health support group which we conduct twice a month. So, in today's session, I will be shedding some light on certain aspects associated with suicide, warning signs, risk factors, protective factors, and some aspects of suicide prevention. So, as we understand, suicide is defined as death which is caused by self directed behavior with an intention to die as a result of the behavior. A suicide attempt is a non fatal, self intentionally injurious behavior with an intention to die as a result of that behavior. So generally, when it comes to signs, a lot of times I feel that there are no warning signs associated with suicide. It's very sudden. A lot of times, it's very hard to identify what these signs are. But we've seen in majority of suicides that take place, there are preceding signs, and these signs are generally in the form of a person's speech, maybe their behavior or their mood, all of it which might point the fact that the person might be experiencing suicidal ideation or feelings. Is why it's important for us to understand what these signs could possibly be. So when it comes to signs, we look at it in terms of speech, behavior, and mood. So when we talk about speech, we're talking about direct verbal signs and indirect verbal signs. So a direct verbal sign, as the name explains, a person is very explicitly mentioning that they want to end their life, they want to die, or they see no point in living. Now, a lot of times, what happens is when people make statements like this, others might dismiss it, might joke about it, may not take it seriously. A lot of times, we have seen, in our workshops when we ask people about what do they think about suicide, or when a person mentions that they want to end their lives, people feel that this might be just a way to ask for attention. So it's not taken seriously most of the time. So it's very important for us to remember that any sign or any statement or speech wherein a is mentioning or stating that they want to end their life, they don't see any point in living, should be taken seriously. So have a direct verbal sign, and then we have indirect verbal signs, which could mean something like, I love you, right? Will you miss me if I'm gone? I can't imagine living the rest of my life like this. So all of these indicate that the person might see no point in living or might be thinking about suicide. The second thing is in terms of behavior. So here we're looking for any kind of an extreme or a sudden change in a person's behavior. So these signs could vary from person to person. Now, for example, one of it could mean increased use of alcohol and drugs. Now, maybe a behavior like this may not always mean a person might be thinking about suicide, but definitely indicates that something is not okay. Maybe this person is with something, wherein alcohol and drugs becomes a major way to cope with a stressor. Looking for a way to their lives, maybe searching for methods online, reading up about it, withdrawing from daily activities. So suddenly not finding any interest in something that you usually enjoy, isolating from family, friends, not wanting to engage or socialize, sleeping too much or too visiting or calling people to say goodbye, sending out messages apologizing or expressing regret or apologies all of a sudden, giving prized possessions. A lot of times people may suddenly want to give away things that they really value or something which is important to them. Then we've seen instances where might either talk a lot about death, separation, either write about it. So all of these signs might indicate that something's not okay. They may be thinking about suicide. um, the next thing is in terms of a person's mood. Now, this could either mean a person might be experiencing depression, like prolonged periods of sadness, maybe anxiety, irritability, experiencing some sense of shame, might be feeling very angry or agitated over the smallest of things. So we have to understand that this could be a very extreme or a sudden change in a person's mood, all of which would mean that one needs to ask if you see it, if you spot it. Now, what happens is when you see these signs, maybe these signs may indicate a person might be thinking about suicide, or it could indicate something else. But what really matters at the end of the day is that if you see something like this, you feel is very unlikely, which you feel very extreme change in a person's behavior, it's important to ask and talk to them. You know, um, the next thing that I'll be talking about is risk factors of suicide. So risk factors, the name suggests, these are factors which increase the likelihood of a person engaging in suicidal behavior or attempting suicide. So we'll be looking at this in terms of four categories. The first one being environmental. So when we talk about environmental, these are factors which stemming from a person's environment. We can talk about stress due to harassment, bullying, divorce, domestic violence, abuse, joblessness, sudden events or crisis. For example, the pandemic, which led to a lot of people losing their loved ones, suddenly losing their jobs, financial instability, feelings of shame, guilt. A lot of times we have seen instances of cyberbullying, wherein a person who has been bullied online may not know where to go for help. There could be feelings of guilt, feelings of shame. Um, then we have access to lethal means. So, easy accessibility to lethal means like firearms, drugs, medications, pesticides also increase the. So, oftentimes we have seen that the rates of suicide can be really high among two very specific occupation groups when we talk about doctors or medical professionals and farmers. One of the factors we look at it is in terms of the easy accessibility. We talk about farmers always accessibility to items like pesticides, which again is where a lot of interventions need to focus on reducing this accessibility, use of these pesticides. Then we have exposure to graphic, sensationalized, glamorized accounts of suicide online, which a lot of young people can easily have access to, where they have a wrong idea, a wrong image of what self harm or suicide is. Then we talk about history of the person. So this would mean when we're talking about suicide of a loved one, or there's a family history of suicide. So what essentially happens here is we've seen that people who may have lost a loved one to suicide are at a higher risk of suicidal ideation. Now this is has a lot to do with the grief a person's experiencing. We have to understand that when people have lost a loved one to suicide, people don't have enough opportunities to talk about that grief. Also, because suicide is so stigmatized in our society, either sometimes a person may not be able to open very easily about what they're going through. around may not be able to talk about this or initiate a conversation. A lot of feelings of personal responsibility attached to the loss. Emotions like anger, guilt, shame, all of which puts a person, of course, in a very vulnerable mental space. And because we don't have enough opportunities to talk about the grief that they're going through, so this is when we talk about the history of the person. When we're talking about individuals with a history of sexual or physical violence in their childhood, those who have previously attempted suicide are also at a higher risk, especially if they're not receiving the right kind of treatment or support. Because again, suicide is so stigmatized that if a person, survives an attempt, people are very likely to dismiss them, say a lot of things which they shouldn't be saying, instead of giving them the right kind of support they need to, work through this. So, the next thing is health problems. So health problems, of course, when we look at it in terms of physical health conditions or mental health conditions. So of course, physical health conditions do bring in a lot of not just physical pain, but emotional pain. A lot of times, in case of chronic or terminal health conditions, a person might be very dependent on their family members. So this might also create feelings of being alone to others. Then when we talk about mental health conditions, a lot of times people may not be aware that they're struggling with something. A lack of awareness means that they may not reach out for help. It remains untreated, and it might it might lead to an increased risk for suicide later on. um, the next topic is emerging threat from social media. So, social media is a very important part of our lives these days. And we have seen that cyberbullying, cyber harassment are somehow directly or indirectly linked to suicide. A lot of young people, have easy accessibility to resources online. We have seen in the last couple of years there was a game called Blue Whale, which required, a lot of young, kids actually tried to play this online game where they were given a set of tasks, and some of these tasks towards the end included acts of self-harm and eventually killing yourself. So we have seen a lot of these websites, forums, chat spaces, which put out very wrong information. And this again points out to the fact that why is it important for us to have more conversations around suicide, with especially young adults, when we talk about reaching out for help, and why is it important? Now, the second aspect that I'll be looking at is the protective factors. As we know, a protective factor is a characteristic or an attribute which reduces the likelihood of attempting or completing suicide. Protective factors could include skills, they can be strengths, resources, which help a person deal more effectively with any stressful event. So, in terms of protective factors, we look at it from the individual, community, and at the family level. So, at the individual level, these protective factors could include a positive physical, emotional, and mental development, good coping skills, a high self esteem, resilience, engagement and connection in these following contexts. So, whether with schools or with your peer group, or in terms of your workplace, or being a part of certain art, culture clubs, anything that allows you to engage with others can be, of course, a protective factor. Then we talk about community, presence of supportive teachers, mentors, and role models. It's very important. For example, I remember, so we recently conducted a conference, for Suicide Prevention Day, and we had a talk by Dr. Farah Sheikh, where she spoke about the need to have a supportive and safe environment for individuals in the LGBTQIA plus community. And why is it important to have safe and supportive environments, for every person? So this becomes really important when it comes to being able to then reach out for help. And second thing, of course, is support for development of your skills, interests, even access to mental health care providers, again, which is very important because not everyone has accessibility to mental health care services in India. Support for development of skills and interests. The next thing is, of course, in terms of family, having supportive, loving relationships with your family members. Again, non aggressive. Again,
Uh,
aggressive, non-violent conflict resolution in the family is also is another protective factor. Hello, am I audible?
yes, Miss Sachi, I can hear you. Miss Mala, if you could try to just rejoin, I think that would help you because we are able to hear her. I've
Yeah.
sent her a message in the chat
Okay.
box. You can continue.
Okay. Okay. So now the last part where I'll just be a little light about suicide prevention and practices for suicide prevention. So it's very important to understand that suicide prevention is a collective responsibility. We always feel that it's a very personal problem, it's a very individual matter, but we have to understand that every person plays a role when it comes to prevention of suicide. Many times when we say suicide prevention, what comes to mind is okay, the mental health system and mental health professionals. But when we say that it's only a mental health issue, what we're then implying is that if we have to see a change, that change only depends on health professionals, and that change will only be possible for those who can access mental resources. Now we know that that's not the case, and when it comes to what the risk factors for suicide, it's not just mental health conditions. There are so many factors that might push a person to the brink of suicide, which is why when we think about suicide prevention, we have to remember it's a collective responsibility which requires people from different sectors to get together, whether we're talking about schools, colleges, um, corporates, whether we're talking about the government, everyone has a role to play. Um, so, in terms of suicide prevention interventions, so generally we see interventions can be of three types. We have the first one is universal. So, a universal intervention is any intervention which affects everyone in a defined population, irrespective of what the risk is. So, these interventions could include factors like public education programs, which either focus on normalizing mental health, you know, and we're talking about reducing suicide risk. These could be programs that focus on awareness surrounding maybe depression and substance use, which often are two common risk factors when it comes to suicide. General awareness around suicide prevention. These interventions could also mean building barriers at suicide hotspots, for example, certain bridges or certain locations where we know these are hotspots for suicide. Um, these interventions could also include promoting responsible media reporting on suicide. This is a general, a very universal intervention that we can implement when it comes to suicide prevention. The second one is selective interventions. Now, selective interventions will subgroups which are at a risk for suicide. So, these subgroups could depend on factors like age, maybe educational status, certain factors which might make them more vulnerable or put them at a risk for suicide. So, for example, we can see there might be certain programs which focus on women in rural areas, certain programs might focus on students who are experiencing high levels of stress. There could be interventions which focus on older people or senior citizens who may be experiencing factors like loneliness or social isolation. Then we of course have gatekeeper trainings, which is very common these days, and we these are for gatekeepers, such as police, teachers, practitioners, community stakeholders who may be able to identify and provide early intervention to people with a possible suicide risk. Now, this is something that we do at Sisters Living Works, wherein we conduct our workshops focus on equipping people with a basic knowledge on what can be done to support suicide crisis. But our second thing, which is our training course, now focuses on teachers and school counselors, because we need to initiate suicide-free environments within school, because we realize a lot of schools are not equipped to deal with instances of suicide, self-harm. It becomes very important in terms of sensitizing students, teachers, in case an attempt takes place in school. How do we ensure the dignity of that student? How do we make other students sensitive to that child? What are some protocols to be followed? This is how its Sisters Living works. We've been trying to focus on these aspects. Um, The next thing, of course, is indicated. So, indicated interventions basically focus on individuals who might be at a very high risk for suicide. So, this could include crisis management or follow up care programs for individuals with a recent suicidal attempt or deliberate self harm behaviors, close monitoring for patients with prior suicide attempts. So, this is something that we see. And of course, in terms of these interventions, there are some areas that we've been working in at this point, and we've seen that it has been of great use. For example, recently, the training course, we were able to understand how a lot of schools in India are not equipped to deal with a suicide crisis. Like, we know if there's an emergency that takes place, we know what is to be done. But what if a child is struggling with suicidal ideation? What if there's an attempt which has taken place? What are we doing to sensitize parents? What are we doing to increase awareness and increase help seeking behavior? Um, so this is essentially what I would like to talk about in my presentation. And of course, at the end of the day, it's very important for us to understand that we need to have more conversations around this topic, because that is where a lot can be done. People are hesitant to bring it up, hesitant to talk about it, but we need to have more conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Miss Sachi. And I think what you rightly said at the end, having conversation, talk about it, that's something that's so important at this point of time. And knowing that it's been 1.5 year, how pandemic has not just affected adults like us, but also at the same time has really affected adolescent, any age population that you would consider. It's such a tremendous change. That's something that happened, and it took time. So thank you so much for sharing, for your understanding and your case study. Miss Naina Sabharwal, are you there? If we could have you.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm gonna present
Yes,
my screen.
sure.
Um, Sorry, I've never done um, Google
You
Meet
want?
before.
Oh yes, we can see your screen.
Yeah, this is what I need. Okay, is this okay? Are you able to see this?
Yes, if you could put it on a presentation mode, if
Yeah,
possible.
I'll just do that.
Oh,
Okay.
done. We can see. Thank
Yep.
you.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you, taking forward a little bit from what Sachi shared, and thank you so much, Sachi, for sharing the risk and protective factors of suicide, and essentially to really look at suicide from a suicidology perspective, which is our area of work. So just to give an introduction, I'm Nyana, the founder of Safe Space. Safe Space began shortly after we started We Hear You, which is a bereavement support group for families who've lost loved ones to suicide, about 4 years ago. And it's run by myself and the co-founder, Dr. Parvin Dadachandji, and another friend of mine. And both of us are suicide loss survivors. And we realized that the impact of the loss to suicide is so fundamental, and yet we did not have adequate support systems to help us heal through this, because with the loss comes a lot of other fallouts and factors that we need to kind of take care of. And that's how We Hear You began. And after We Hear You began, we had a lot of us in a room sharing our loss. It occurred to me as to why are we all even in a room? Why are we losing our loved ones to suicide when suicide is actually the most preventable death? And we should not be losing loved ones to suicide. And that's how Safe Space was born, with the intention of making India suicide free. We work in the space of, as shared earlier, prevention, intervention, and postvention. In the intervention space, we actually intervene in active suicides and have done so in over 500, with all persons safe at this present moment. In terms of prevention, we are currently work directly with the National Centre of Suicide Prevention UK to offer suicide first response training here in India, which is a qualification program based in the UK, and we're working very closely with the Indian Association of Private Psychiatry to ensure that psychiatrists and psychologists also have access to the skill of first response, which is based on a brief intervention model, which allows us to keep a person safe and safety plan for them. And then, of course, postvention is the support groups that we run, because we know that postvention is prevention for the next generation. Because the loss to suicide, almost 60% of those who lose somebody to suicide go on to have thoughts of suicide and do suiciding behavior. That's how Safe Space has kind of evolved over the years. And today, um, I'm going to just talk to you about positive psychology and suicide prevention and just the shifts that we're seeing in the space of suicide from a suicidology perspective. So this year in September, when we had Suicide Prevention Day, the theme was creating hope through action. And there was something very interesting about this, because hope, as we say, is hold on, pain ends. It is creating the hope through action, and hope becomes a really important word because it's directly linked to positive psychology, and we will see that in just a second. So suicide, as shared by Sachi, is also the act of deliberately killing oneself and with the intent to take one's life. And in India, and globally, the statistics have seen about 800,000 deaths by suicide each year. India, we lose about 285,000, which is about 785 a day, which is about 32 every hour, of which one is every hour we lose one student. What we also need to understand is that post-pandemic, we are at the risk, as the WHO says, to something called PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And when we talk about suicide, we also have to talk about trauma. Trauma is anything that is an event that is sudden and has a long-lasting sort of impact. And then there's complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is if a single trauma event occurs for a longer period of time. Example, abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, addiction in the family. All of these factors contribute to PTSD. The pandemic is contributing to PTSD, given that people have experienced loss of jobs, certainty, isolation. Families may have addiction, living with abuse, which also increases the chances of suicidality 2 to 5 times. So we're really looking at suicidality in this country from a more holistic perspective when we look at it from the lens of being trauma informed. So suicide prevention activities are not new. They've been around for decades. Yet we're not able to see that the impact, it has impacted the rates of suicide. They aren't getting any lower. And the question is why? And research so far for suicide prevention in the past has always been on focusing on risk factors for suicide and suicidality, which is something that Sachi had talked about. Which what are those risk factors, and trauma being one of them, mental illness being one of them, prior attempt being, loss of a loved one to suicide being risk factors to suicidality, and other forms of aspects that Sachi has already highlighted, which I'm not quite going to go into much detail. So, but what we are seeing is a movement away from the focus on risk assessment to risk mitigation. So for years and years and years, suicidologists and people in the space of suicide prevention research really looked at, okay, what is the risk? How do we find out if somebody is at risk? Because there are no symptoms to suicidality, right? There are risk factors and protective factors. We may hear them say things and do things and pick those signs up, but there is no symptom. And there might be risk factors, and that's where we actually gauge and we do risk assessments. In the world of clinicians, what we do find is, and we have seen, is that risk assessment does not really help us identify or help somebody stay safe, because a risk assessment is point in time. So globally, there is a movement towards risk mitigation, which is to say, okay, fine, there are risk factors. How do I mitigate that by safety planning for a person? So more and more, the focus has kind of reduced from just looking at risk factors and trying to reduce risk factors, because There might be multiple risk factors, including sometimes we hear, oh, what do we do if the person who has thoughts of suicide has issues with being in a triggering environment, that is an abusive environment. We may not able to take the person out, but what can we do if we can't reduce the risk? What else can we do? And that's the kind of big question that we've kind of been left with in the world of suicide prevention and suicidology. So if you look at the trajectory change, really, what we're seeing is that in the 60s, we looked at risk and risk identification. About the 80s, we started looking at really talking about, does this person who has thoughts of suicide even have reasons for living? And Marsha Linehan talks about it a lot, who developed DBT. By the 90s, we were talking about hope-based prevention, and hope has become a big part of the conversation around suicide and suicide prevention. And around the turn of the century, we had the introduction of a science called positive psychology by Seligman, who basically said, why are we constantly looking at just risk and despair and trying to reduce that versus focusing on, what might be present, which is the strengths of the person, the focus on protective factors, and increasing connectedness. Because what they found that one of the most concrete ways of keeping a person safe is building connection, keeping them linked to connected ways in family, in community, in their social circles, etc. Recently, what we're seeing is, and even with the American Association of Suicidology, the conversation now is creating a life worth living. So the move has come away from just risk and despair to how do we create a life worth living, and therefore how do we look at the protective factors and the strength-based approach, which is what positive psychology talks about as well. So if I look at just the psychosocial theories of suicide, really, right, and really try to connect what it says to what we're talking about in terms of positive psychology today, which is this huge conversation around the strengths-based approach and not just risk factors. The three ones that I'm going to talk about, the ones that are talked about the most and kind of fall back as theoretical and conceptual frameworks, a lot more in global paradigms of suicide prevention than some of the other ones that we would have studied and learned and talked about. So joiners is probably the one that we hear about the most, which is the interpersonal theory of suicide, which is the interpersonal sort of relationship. And there are three factors that he talks about, which is a person has thwarted belongingness, which means that they do not have a sense of belonging within their communities, which takes me back to what I talked about social connectedness earlier. He then goes on to talk about burdensomeness, when a person begins to talk about being a burden and not able to create or being a meaningful participant to his own life or to creation of society. And the third factor is the capability of suicide, which is the ability to cause oneself harm. And he said when all of these factors are in play, a person may go on to think of suicide or doing suiciding behaviors. And suicide is on a continuum from thinking about suicide, planning, preparing, and doing the behavior. And so a person may have thwarted belongingness and burdensomeness, but the capability to do behaviors that are harming oneself is requisite to moving along the continuum. Schneidman was the father of suicidology, and he really talked about something called psychic, which is the deep emotional pain that a person experiences when they are experiencing thoughts of suicide or doing the behavior. And that comes from deep unmet psychological needs. He talks about it as, early childhood adverse experiences, or ACEs as we call it today, and what traumas we might have experienced and the impact that has on our ability to build emotional regulation, a strong sense of self, a sense of motivation and volition and hope, and keep it consistent. And the inability to do that, to able to meet one's own psychological needs, leads to this frustration, which is called deep emotional pain or psychic. And the third one is the integrated motivational volition model, which is a tripatriate kind of a model, which basically talks about the presence of a past history and the current stressors that need to work together in order to create suiciding behavior. And they go through different stages. And depending on what is present in the person in each stage in terms of, for example, coping skills, or whether there is thwarted belongingness, or whether there is a fearlessness to that, impacts whether a person will move through those stages or not. And all of these factors, the commonality that we hear is certain factors of the sense of hope, hopelessness, helplessness, burdensomeness, lack of belonging, lack of social connectedness, frustrated needs, and life stressors. So these are like the underpinnings of several social psychosocial theories of suicide that are that are built on to create conceptual frameworks around ways to which we can prevent suicide using these as a base. Um, how does positive psychology play a role in these theories of suicide and suicidology? If you look at positive psychology, it talks about the scientific study of making life more worth living, right? And if I go back to what I said about the American Association of Suicidology, that the suicidology world and suicide prevention is moving away from just assessing risk and despair and what the issue is to what does the person have in terms of coping skills, resilience, family, education, that is available to them, that can be built on to help them sort of move towards a life that is worth living. Of course, there are factors of uh, underlying genetics and epigenetics that play a role. So obviously, taking into consideration if there is mental illness, there is adequate medical as well as therapeutic support, and all of this is a obvious underpinning. And here, positive psychology also focuses on the subjective experience of the person. There is hope, there's optimism, there's satisfaction, and there is goal orientation. Now, when Seligman, who also had coined the term of learned helplessness, which all of us have probably heard of in our psychology, he basically said that there is three main sort of elements to positive psychology. One is positive experiences that give happiness, joy, inspiration. The second is the actual state or traits that give you that, which is gratitude, resilience, and compassion. And compassion has actually become a really big part of trauma-informed suicidology because it talks about the essential feeling of being a burden and factors like that, which is the human's incapability of seeing themselves as a contributing member, which is seems counterintuitive to positive psychology, but it's a very interesting sort of approach, which I will share in just a second. In the field of positive psychology, it goes back to the character strength. It talks about optimism, well being, self compassion, self esteem, confidence, hope, and elevation. Which, when we look at a person with thoughts of suicide, we seem to think that there is none of that there. But actually, in terms of the recent shifts in the way we're understanding trauma and suicidality, we're seeing shifts in ways in which this can actually play a very, very important role. So when we look at positive psychology, Selman calls this something called Perma, where he said we need positive emotion, which we see sometimes is not available in when we see the psychosocial theories, because it's always talking about hopelessness and burdensomeness, whereas Seligman talks about a positive emotion. Joyner himself, who talked about this burdensomeness, said there is positive emotion even in that person at that point of time. So to say that there is only the despair is not actually accurate. They talked about engagement, which is being fully absorbed in stimulating activities, which is having goals, for example. Relationship with others that are possible, that are positive and nurturing, because breakdown of connectedness, thwarted belongingness actually links back to feelings of connection to suicidality, which in positive psychology sort of enhances strengthening some of those relationships. Uh, it also focuses on meaning, having a greater purpose in life, and accomplishment, which is the pursuit of your goals and actually achieving those, which are all very key elements of working with suicidality, because these are the very things that are sort of thwarted in a person with thoughts of suicide behaviors and feelings of doing suiciding behavior. The inability or the blockage of goals and the ability to meet those goals, or having the ability to plan towards those goals. And Snyder really talks about it really well. So positive psychology further is based on several theories, like a hope theory or the self-determination theory. There is a broad and build theory, but I'm not going to go into all of that because that would just become really complex. But how would we actually kind of look at something like the hope theory or the self-determination theory within the therapeutic environment? So to say that positive psychology is a standalone, today it's actually talked about in terms of a supplement to the therapeutic environment. So how do I use CBT plus positive psychology? How do I use DBT plus positive psychology? Because they have a lot of overlaps in kind of the conversations that they're having around building emotional regulation, building compassion, mindfulness, and some of those factors that we see in even DBT skills that we are building. Or, for example, positive thought, self image, which is a part of CBT as well as positive psychology. So the hope theory essentially in psychology really looks at the ability to allow a person to have goals, but also to work with them to break down those goals into smaller sub goals and how they might achieve it, to create a sense of agency in a person, a sense of choice in a person, a sense of resilience in a person, a sense of cognitive skills in a person. And all of these factors contribute, are theories of positive psychology, but they also contribute fundamentally to one's ability to see themselves as a contributing member in society, to see themselves as belonging to a group of people, for example, social connectedness, and their ability to actually meet some of their psychological needs that have been frustrated earlier on in life. The self-determination theory in positive psychology talks about the individual's self-confidence and their efficacy, or their own sense of competence, the sense of creating personal choice in people's lives, because that's something we hear a lot in suicidality, is this feeling of being stuck, and this feeling that I don't have agency and I don't have control over my own life anymore. And the only way of control is therefore to then do the behavior as an escape from the unbearable pain. And relatedness or connectedness, which becomes a big part of self-determination. And all of these positive factors beautifully play back into the very theories that we talked about, that are thwarted or not met in those with experiencing extreme psych ache. So how do we actually use positive psychology in a already therapeutic sort of methodology, and what would that look like? And by this, I say only in long-term intervention, that is in a therapeutic space, and I'm not talking about crisis intervention. In crisis intervention, the idea is that we do the brief intervention model, and we safety plan for someone and get them the help that they need. Doing any of positive psychology or doing therapy during the time of an active thoughts of suicide or doing suiciding behavior can actually be counterproductive and counterintuitive. So I just want to flag that there, because the person is not in a space to able to see themselves in the light of a positive sense of self, and therefore creating a relational container is more important. However, in a therapeutic alliance, whether it's a school counselor, as a parent, as a therapist, as a psychiatrist, or as any other person who's working with or speaking to someone who is experiencing or talking about this deep sense of hopelessness or helplessness that comes along with suicidality. If we look at internal family systems, because we know that there is a large link between trauma and suicidality. and today the link is very strong, established, and this also includes deliberate self-harm, is that when a person undergoes trauma, the person, fragments into different parts. And suicidality is one part of the person and not the whole person. And the ability to therefore talk to a person about the different parts, which may be have more positive self-regard and self connection, is a very uh, uh, important, but also a great way to add in positive psychology. So, for example, if there was a young adult that I was working with thoughts of suicide, has does deliberate self harm, has a very very strong sense of a negative sense of self. Uh, but we were able to establish that the self harm or the thoughts of suicide is one part that exists, but the human itself, the person she is, has different other parts. And when we started, kind of working through what are the other parts that she actually recognizes in herself, that she feels are also a part of her, she was actually, for the first time, without actually being triggered about, no, there's nothing good about me and there's nothing that I can see should be worth living, was able to identify aspects such as curiosity, compassion, aspects like, I'm very intelligent, I actually am like problem solving, I'm able to, be a really good friend, and I have great friends and I have great connections. And bringing that aspect of, therefore, positive psychology in there to say, okay, fine, because that has concepts of hope, gratitude, compassion, to ask her, to ask her, it was to ask her to able to identify these things that she might be happy and grateful for. Again, it depends on the rapport between the relational container created, because some of these things can be a trigger for the client, and that would be something that we do with caution. But looking at positive psychology, not focusing on trying to argue with the suiciding or the self-harm part, which is kind of something that we then keep aside and say, okay, fine, there is this part that exists, and this part is there, but if there are other parts, how can we get them to coexist and kind of get one part to sort of hold the other part, and how do we make them coexist in a way that is healthy versus creating or causing oneself harm, which then becomes a balance of the person's overall being and personality, and looking at them more holistically rather than being all suicidal or all self-harming in that single moment, which brings back the concept of agency, choice, autonomy, self-efficacy, and the other factors that positive psychology actually really enables today. So it gets us to focus on the protective factors and a strengths-based approach, uh, where the person's then able to see them, to build their own resources, to recognize that there are things within that can actually help them, keep them safe, and they actually have those resources. And that is a very a way or a case that we have used positive psychology in, and can be used in a therapeutic environment for us going forward. So that was really my bit in terms of how we can use or talk about positive psychology today, or positive suicidology. And I'm happy to accept any questions either now or later based on the time that we have. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Miss Nyana, for this. I think we did had a webinar on positive psychology, but this gives a very different perspective about how it is different from, how it could be used with combining of other therapies like CBT or REBT with suicidology. So I think it gave me personally a lot of insight about it, and also considering to what Miss Sachi spoke about the risk factors, how it's so different that it might be universal, it might be very selective, or it might just be very indicative that a person would just verbally share the thoughts or the feelings that they are there. So we are open for questions, participants, if you have any questions to ask for Miss Sachi or for Miss Nayana. So I'm very curious. So I have a question for Miss Sachi. Since you've been working, with so many suicide survivors, uh, can you like in a brief share your experience, or any one case that comes to your mind with something that would help our participants to know about our entire webinar, or as a suicide prevention suicidology.
So basically at SLW, I do work, like we do, of course, I do facilitate suicide groups, but I primarily like working in the space of conducting workshops. And I've had like some wonderful, I think moments wherein we've realized how important it is in terms of having conversations. Like, for example, I remember this one time we conducted a session with an organization that empowers, female students from different parts of the country. And we conducted a session on suicide prevention awareness for them. And these were girls who were, logging in from very remote parts of India. And I remember we after one of these sessions, one of like the participants, she reached out to us and she said that just being in that session or someone talking about just the topic of suicide and mental health made her realize that she'd been struggling with a lot of factors in the last couple of years, and suddenly she found some courage to open up and talk about what she had been going through. And because she didn't receive a lot of support at home, she did not know where to go to. In terms of accessibility was a problem. So somewhere just that very conversation gave her the courage to reach out to us, and we were able to then connect her to the counselors from her organization. And that really sort of brings me back to the point that we are very hesitant to talk about suicide, because there is this assumption that, if a lot of times it's a very common myth that talking about suicide or mentioning suicide either increases the risk or creates the risk, and people might get an idea. And which is why, even if you feel someone might be struggling, we're very hesitant to open up or even just ask them, are you doing okay? Or is this something that you've been thinking about? So it's very important to kind of, you know, ask and have conversations, because this really creates a space for a two-way communication. For all someone might be struggling, may need to reach out, may need your support. So we really encourage people to have more open conversations on the topic. um,
True. I think I absolutely agree to what you're saying, that, a lot of times just listening, active listening is one of the core skills that as a psychologist, it does require. So thank you for sharing. We have a question. Miss Ria has asked, how do we handle a situation where a person calls you and say that they feel suicidal right now? So, Miss Naina, would you like to
I'd
share your
love
thoughts on
to.
this?
I'd love to. So yeah, we've trained over 400 first responders to do this. Uh, so Ria, thank you so much for that question. So there's several things you can do depending on your background. If you are a psychologist or a friend or a family member or something, it really depends on that. Yeah, and so one of the first things I would say is thank them for reaching out and letting you know that they have thoughts of suicide, and that you're so glad that you're going to do whatever it takes to get them the help that they need, because 5 out of 6 people will not die by suicide if they get the help that they need. And the first step would be just to listen to their distress, not to try to convince them not to do something, because like I said, we can't convince somebody not to do something. What we can do is to help just listen. And we talked about active listening, but actually listening in itself is a whole polyvagal response. And if you actually read polyvagal theory, you will understand that actually the person just talking about it actually brings their body down. It kind of calms them down. It brings their body down to homeostasis, which means that they can then start thinking rationally again, and they themselves will reach a point where they'll be able to tell you, thank you so much for listening. The next step would probably be to get them access to mental health professionals to see if there is an underlying mental health condition that they need additional help for. You let them know that you are somebody that they can reach out to should you want to be that first responder for them. Alternately, you can connect them to different helplines. Kiran is a great one. Samaritans has a very strong first response helpline as well. Um, Additionally, you can train yourself to become a gatekeeper or a suicide first responder so that you know the active steps on how to do that. Um, You may also let them know, listen, I am so glad that you called. I am not 100% sure how to help, but I promise I will listen. And that is, probably one of the best things you can do for them at that point of time. At the end of that call, give them additional support of helplines. Let them know that any other additional support, like getting them professional help, is something that you could probably help them with and that you recommend. But in the future, if they do need additional support, you may still want to be that friend that they can reach out to. um, yeah, so that is what I would say one can do.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Naina, for answering that. We have another question. It says, how do we handle and help out students who mention having environmental risk factors and feel suicidal, especially when they report obstacles like not being financially independent and parents not supporting for therapy or not being able to talk about it freely in the home space? So
Um,
how would you help them out here?
would you want Sachi to answer, or
Anyone. I mean, we just kept it open.
um, Sachi, would you like to answer, or should I take
You
that
can
on?
you can take it out, Nana, if you
Okay,
want. Yeah.
okay. So essentially, with students, the important thing to understand here is students, depending on the age, up to the age of 24, their rational brain hasn't grown. It's their emotional brain, so they talk from emotion. We need to talk to them back from emotion. If you try to rationalize with a young adult, that really never kind of works out. It sounds like white noise to them. That's the one thing I've learned in working with young adults. Because they're not able to see solutions because their rational brain, their prefrontal cortex is not formed as yet. There's several things we can do in that case, and that is to recognize that they do not have the environment and they do not have the parental support, but they may and will have additional family members that they may reach out to. They may have people within their school, for example, teachers or somebody that they might be close to. They may have friends. They would have other forms of protective factors that we need to kind of focus on. Therefore, again, the movement is away from risk to more understanding the protective factors of the child. Now, what do they have that kind of works for them? Using things like art-based conversations, getting them to write, getting them to use other forms of therapy, music, art, things like that, or even just giving them things to do, activities to do that can help sort of get them, away from, at that point of time, the rumination of thoughts, to kind of help them stay in a space that is safe within them, their own self. Teaching them emotional regulation, teaching them mindfulness, meditations, are all very, very effective ways with young adults, to actually get the help that they need. Creating short-term goals to help them get the sense of victory and that they have what it takes to get their life without the parental support or without the need of that. So the focus isn't on what I'm getting, but what I already have, which is my own resources. And that's how we build agency in young adults, to be able to say, oh my God, I had my own resources. And they may say no. And what we need to say is, hey, you know what? Something brought you into my office. Something asked you to reach out to me. There is something in there that really cares about you and knows what to do to keep you safe. And kind of and picking on those strengths and factors, and us ourselves actually becoming aware of what does this person have that I can keep bringing up to their attention, that can actually get them to recognize and tap into their own resources when they need it. Additionally, of course, giving young adults also access to support groups, helplines, and things like that is always very helpful. Having, making sure that you know who their additional support is, probably a grandparent or an aunt or somebody like that, who are protective factors for them. Academic achievement could be a protective factor, for example. Being popular in school could be another one. So there are other factors. So just focusing more on the protective factors and building resilience within that space would be helpful. So Prachi, what if the person's adamant not to go to a professional? I think is a question you asked me based on the previous one. If the person's not ready to go to a professional, what we can do is couple of things. Either you want to continue to be their first responder, or then you connect them to or give them access to helplines and first responders. The person may not be in that position to able to a person with thoughts of suicide already thinks there's something fundamentally wrong with them. Going to a mental health professional is almost saying that yes, there is something wrong with you, and that's very, very difficult. And that only happens probably after a few conversations when there's adequate rapport. Sometimes you have to hold the person for a month or so and continuously remind them that you're there for their best, and that at least you will call XYZ or me, or take an emergency contact that you know that they can connect to and say, hey, just let me know that you will actually reach out if you need that help, if you're not ready to go to a professional as yet. Connecting them to support groups. There are a lot of them right now for grief, for addiction, for trauma. Connect them to that, because there would probably be an aspect of that there that can help them build community for themselves and not isolate. Isolation is actually probably one of the things that we want to sort of protect them from.
Thank you so much, Miss Naina. If the same thing I want to ask Miss Sachi, since you do conduct a lot of, how if what would you do if somebody is very adamant, or you just the as Miss Ishita has also mentioned that what if the person is suicidal, but isn't very ready or very reluctant to visit to a therapist? What I'm sure you would have experienced this, going to a mental health professional. Uh, what if you could throw us some light on your experience for this?
Yeah, I think this is something which, of course, we come across very commonly, especially during our workshops with students. A lot of them mentioning that, they're still very hesitant to reach out to mental health professionals. Also, that sometimes therapy is expensive. So it again becomes another factor as to how and when can we afford this or no. So, of course, there are ways. We do have certain distress helplines which a person can access, and you can let them know about it. I think, of course, is that there's one aspect when it comes to reaching out to a mental health professional. People do have a lot of hesitation. So maybe, of course, having more conversations with them. Sometimes they might just need the support of someone when it comes to approaching a mental health professional or going for therapy. So again, being able to offer that kind of support, but letting them know the resources that are available in terms of distress helplines that you can call up, especially sometimes at night. We've had members talk about, we've had shared how these helplines have actually been very useful for them, especially at night, when they felt a lot of distress. Reaching out has actually made them feel a lot more better. So letting them know that these are resources available. And as Naina mentioned, we do have support groups for them which are free of cost, and are something that people can engage in, because I think in times like this there's a sense of course, being isolated, not being around people. But I think even just having that sense of community, even if that's on a virtual space, can be really helpful. So being letting them know that there's something called, you have something called support groups, because people aren't aware of what support groups are and why do they exist. So I think I think that again is something which can be really helpful, letting them know of these other resources that they can tap into, and so that is something that, yeah, in terms of if a person's really adamant to seek mental health support immediately. So these are some things you can let them know about.
All right. Thank you so much, Miss Sachi. I think that gives us a lot of hands-on understanding that yes, that's a very typical concern that we also do face. When we have adolescent, we have pre-adolescent teens to come up and say that okay, there are certain concerns, but should I reach out to a mental health profession? I should not. It's still a stigma or a taboo that we call it to reach out to them that way. So, all right. So, I would like to thank both of our speakers. Thank you so much for such a wonderful session. I think not just me, but all the participants would have got a lot of insight about our today's webinar. So, thank you so much, Ms. Sachi and Ms. Naina, for joining us. And I would like to thank all the participants for joining for today's webinar. We did posted a feedback link, so if you could click on the link and give us a feedback, it would be really very helpful. Thank you once again to both of you all, as well as to the participants for joining for today's webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Sachi.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you so
Karishma. Thank you,
much.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.